We're going to kick things off with Niamh. If you're ready, come on down, and we'll get started. Again, you don't see Claire; she's doing nothing. And yeah, hopefully we're ready to roll.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. All good? Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. Hello, my name is Niamh. I'm a front-end web developer, and today I want to talk about Storybook and how you can use it to make your life in a tech team a lot easier and generally lovelier. Having said that, I do think if you are a front-end developer and maybe you're a bit like me, you might be thinking right now, oh my God, not another front-end library, like there are like a bajillion already. And I know it sometimes can be totally overwhelming trying to keep up with all of them and stay on top of everything. But I promise you, Storybook is a really good one. And it can make your life so much better. It did for me, at least. And it did it in two kind of key ways. So firstly, it just streamlines UI testing and documentation. And it drives clean, sustainable component libraries. And my goal for this talk is to unpack both these points. So we will be taking a look at why Storybook is needed, and we'll look at what this looks like with Storybook and without. We'll cover what kinds of impacts it can have, not just on engineers, so don't worry if you're not an engineer. It has great benefits for everyone on a team, so like designers, product managers, marketers, etc. And then we'll finish with a bit of coding, and I'll demo how to get up and running with Storybook and start playing around with it. I will caveat, I will be using a bit of React, but if you don't use React, I don't think it's a huge deal. Like you can kind of, I won't take offense if you zone out to some of those parts. I think if you have a core kind of understanding of programming, you'll be able to transfer over the concepts pretty easily. If you don't program at all, I won't just be coding the whole time, so don't freak out either. Okay, but before we dive into it, as I said, my name is Niamh. I used to have blonde hair, now I don't. I should update that picture. But I'm a front-end web developer, and I'm from Dublin, where I now live and work for a company called Elsewhen. They're a digital consultancy based in London, which is where I used to live before the pandemic, before remote working became such a big thing. And I do love being at home in Dublin because it means, you know, without any commute, I get to spend the hour in the morning swimming in the sea instead of being crammed into a tube with hundreds of other miserable people. So it's pretty great. And since moving home, I have to say this is my first real life meetup. So I'm very excited to be here and see you all in real life. I used to love going to meetups in London a lot. So I'm really excited to get to know the tech community here in Ireland. So very happy to be here. Okay, so let us dig into it. As I sort of mentioned already, the main benefits I want to share with you are streamlining testing and documentation. So this essentially just means reducing all of those bottlenecks that you get like at the tail end of the production process. You know, if you're trying to deploy something and everything's going really well until the very last bit, which is really annoying. And writing cleaner, more sustainable code. So this just makes for, as I said, a lovelier dev experience all around. Which, you know, who doesn't want that? Okay, so to unpack all of this, I will go through components and libraries. And Claire did touch on this earlier. But for anyone who wasn't there, I'll just cover again what components and engineering are. I'll just quickly explain it for anyone, maybe if you haven't had much exposure to this yet. But I am willing to bet there are some developers here who have at some point come to a project, onboarded, taken one look at the code base and thought like, oh my God, like what? So I'll go a bit further into component libraries, how to build and maintain them, just for a nicer experience overall with as few pain points as possible, because this is really important for getting the most out of React. So it will be worth it, and you will thank yourself when you start using it. And then I'll take a look at the typical production process, or at least what I think is a typical production process. And I'll highlight some common places where, in my experience, things can tend to break down a little easily. And if you're not careful, everyone can get a lot of headaches and it can be a right pain. And finally, as I said, I'll show you what Storybook looks like. I'll tell you what it is if you don't know. And how you can use it to avoid all of those pitfalls and frustrating parts of your job and get back to, you know, the more fulfilling aspects of your work. Okay, so we will start off with components. So for anyone who's just starting out or hasn't had that much experience, components are essentially templates that you create with code, and you can then populate them with content really easily and really quickly as many times as you want. And I think this is part of the reason why React is such a popular library, right? Because it lets you componentize your code relatively straightforwardly with running efficiently in the browser. So I'm sure lots of you might have seen this idea before in Disney films where animators have clearly reused scenes between different movies. And a component library in code or a design, I think, works pretty much the exact same way. So if you look through any given website, I don't think it would take you very long to find the same patterns being repeated over and over again, kind of like the same way you can with Disney movies. So this is just an example. I'll take a look at my company's website here. Pretty quickly, you'll begin to see patterns, right? So for instance, you can see repeats of things like image grids, text styling, and composition. So each of these patterns here are all just components being reused over and over again. And to manage them, you have component libraries. And these are just ways to arrange your components, keeping your code organized and easy to navigate. Especially for, as I said, if you've got a new developer coming on board and they need to get to grips with everything quickly, it can be super handy. And a neat way to do this is by subdividing your libraries. So at the top tier of the code base, generally where you have your small components like buttons, input fields, things that are like very specific, that usually show up on a website in lots of different places, usually pretty much in the same way. And the next tier down from that, we have component libraries that are a little more specific. So you might have like components that are particular to blogs or to forms and stuff like that. So the idea here is that the lower the level, the more specific the libraries become. And the more specific they become, generally speaking, the larger and more complex they are. And as a rule, specific ones can always use components from a higher tier if they need to. And generally speaking, not the other way around. So you want everything to flow neatly from top to bottom. And I'm just saying this because this flow is mimicked in Storybook as well. So as I kind of said, the nicer your component library is set up, the nicer your Storybook experience is going to be, which will be super important to you pretty soon. Okay, so we've briefly covered components and libraries to get you set up for the best Storybook experience possible. Now let's take a look at the production process. Okay, and I want you all to do a bit of imagining with me if you don't mind. So imagine you're working on a project. You are the main developer taking care of the front end of a website. The site itself was already built when you got to it, so there's already some components in there built with React. It's already live, it's looking great, and it's working as normal. Life is great. Your job is to update the site with new content whenever the client needs. So for example, they might say, hey, we want to add a new page. This is what the production process might look like for that. So first, the marketing team creates the new page. Then the designers design the page. Then, I can't even read my own thing there. The design is handed over to the engineers. Then the engineers go and build the page. And then the page gets put into a test environment where if everything looks okay and it passes the QA team after assessing it, it'll then get deployed. So it seems like a pretty straightforward process, right? And overall, don't get me wrong, I think it is. And I'm sure there are lots of places that use process like this that is totally fine and works great. But I will say, I just think without carefully considering what kind of approach you use to build out your components and your libraries, this workflow can get really muddy really quickly. I know, don't we all relate so much? So a lot of times suddenly as if out of nowhere, as I said, when you're after going through building all the page and you're about to deploy, everything's looking great. And then suddenly, before you deploy, things just don't quite fit and it looks a bit weird. You might start to spot lots of tiny niggly differences between the build and the design where, it might not look totally broken, but it doesn't quite match the design either, which can be really annoying. And this happens, even though we're using the exact same components over and over again, we're populating them with content that is slightly different. So, you know, we can't really be too surprised when stuff doesn't look exactly the same every time. Okay, so you might think in this case, well, why don't we just change the content to make it fit nicely into the design? Well, you absolutely could do that. But here's what that might look like, right? So the UI tester, or whoever it is, spots this inconsistency first. Then they go and report it. Then the marketing team will come up with new content to fit into the design. Then they'll create the ticket for engineering. Then the engineer goes and makes the change. Then the change gets merged into the testing environment. Then, if it passes, great, you can deploy. If not, you repeat the entire process again. So like, you kind of start to see the issue here a little bit, right? It's gross, in my opinion. So this is just an example so you can see, you know, what might seem like a really small and straightforward change actually ends up taking quite a disproportionate amount of resources a lot of the time. And who wants to repeat this process for every single bit of weirdness on a website, right? We all want to kind of just get on with our lives and not worry about it too much, right? Well, this is where Storybook comes in to help us out. So has anyone actually heard of Storybook or maybe even used it before? Oh, good. Okay, great. So Storybook, that some of you might know then, is a front-end tool used by a lot of companies like Elsewhere, GitHub, Airbnb, Stripe, companies like that. And it lets you build and maintain components in total isolation. And what do I mean by this? Well, even though in your code base, every component has its own file, usually by the time you actually get to see the component in the browser, it's already built into working with, you know, tons of other elements on the page. So Storybook lets you see every component on its own in the browser, where you can play around with it before you start integrating it with any designs. So I'm going to show you all what Storybook looks like, how you can use it, and how you can get started with it yourself. And I'll start with how to install it and get it set up. Then I'll cover how to navigate Storybook in the browser. We'll take a look at what stories are, things like args and controls, and we'll create some stories ourselves. And hopefully by then, you'll have a bit of insight into how to play around with it and make the most of its benefits for your whole team. Okay, so we'll just get started with installation. I'm not going to actually do this here, but I'll just leave the commands up there if you want to try it out yourself. I will say that you cannot install Storybook on an empty project, so you already need to have one set up, and it doesn't have to use any particular frameworks. So Storybook works with most of the popular front-end frameworks. But for this example, I'm just going to suggest that you use Create React App, kind of out of laziness, because you could do it in just these 3 commands on the left here to get your app up and running. So say that you've done all that and you've created your React app. All you need then are these 2 commands on the left, on the right, sorry, to get Storybook up and running. So the first one installs and executes it there. And then after that, if you run npm Storybook, it will launch Storybook in dev mode and open it up in the browser for you. And this is what it'll look like when it opens in the browser. And this is, by default, Storybook uses all of its own config and stuff, boilerplate, to get you set up with this. So you can see it's got a lot of like documentation, links to tutorials, and like bits and bobs that you can play around with yourself. And this is in the main window here. So where all of that stuff is what's called the canvas area, which is where your components will appear. And on the left-hand side, oh, sorry, I'm getting confused. Oh yeah, the left-hand side is the sidebar where all of your components are listed. And there is where you'll be able to click into any of them to have a look at the components in the canvas. And you'll notice there when you click onto one of them on the sidebar that you have all of these various versions listed. These are what are called stories, and they just describe particular states of a component. So for example, if you have a button, you know, it can have a primary state, which is one story. It can have a secondary state, which is another, or an invalid state, which is another story, and so on and so forth. So just note that when you hear the word story, all that's describing is this particular state of a component. So as well as stories, to display the different states, you also have what are called controls. And when you click into a story, the controls will appear underneath the canvas area there. And these are just how you play around with a component. So for example, with the button, you can control things like what size it is, what label it displays, whether it's in a primary state or not. And you can play around with different styles here as well. And it's, I think, good to just note that as the developer, you can control the controls. Okay, so you can decide what actually shows up there and what way that you can play around with your components. So it's nice and flexible, and you can, as I say, you have total control over how you set it up. Okay, so let's take a look at how to create some stories ourselves. So to create a component story, you first have to have a story file for Storybook to read. And the file name should be structured with the component name, followed by .stories.js or JSX or TS or whatever you want really. All Storybook needs is for the file to be named component.stories.blah, and it'll automatically read that file and push it into the browser for you. Okay, so now we have our story file. Next, we want to actually create the story, which is essentially just a function that returns a component state given a set of arguments. And the two main things that you need are the default export, which describes the component, and the named exports, and they describe the stories themselves. Oh, great, it's working. Okay. So let's do the default export first. This controls how Storybook lists your stories in the sidebar. And it can do some other cool stuff too, but I think for today, I'll just leave it at this. And you're going to give it, so you're going to import your component there, and you're going to give it a title, which is what the story will be listed as in the sidebar in the browser. And you're also going to pass it a component, which is going to be, in this case, the button that we've imported. And we've created the button already with some styling and stuff, which we won't worry about here. Oh. Sorry, this is a thing. Oh, yeah. So yeah, we won't worry about like styling and everything here. It's already set up in the app, so we'll just focus on how it integrates with Storybook. So this is the default export. Yay. Let's now make the named export, which defines the component stories. So you write this like any other function, only here we're going to pass it what Storybook calls args. And these work the same way that you'd normally pass arguments to any component function, but in Storybook, they are just described in one JavaScript object instead. And we're going to create that after we write this function. So when we go to pass values to our components or to our props, we're passing them from the stories args object. So instead of, what you might expect to see in React, label equals label, it'll just be label equals args.label, because we'll get it from the args object. Okay, so now we have our first named export called primary. Let's create the args object. So we'll create primary.args to match the story name. And from here, we can pass whatever values we want, right? So long as they just match the prop types, right? So the label prop is expecting a string. We'll call it submit for now. Disabled is a Boolean, so we'll keep that as false just to begin with. And size we have set up as a string, so we'll just make it small to start with. Okay, so now we have our args object and our story. And as I said, we've got styling that we'll see in a sec. So now that we have our named export and our args object, our button should appear in the browser. So this is great. Our component is in the browser. We now have a primary button story, but what if we want to make a secondary story as well? Well, to do that, we just create another named function that uses the button, but this time we'll just pass it the secondary prop as well. And since we already have our primary args object above, instead of repeating all of the same values for our secondary button, we can just pass it primary.args.whatever. Just, half out of laziness, but also, if you wanted to go and create a secondary.args object and pass it its own values, you could totally do that as well. You get the idea. Hurry up, Kelly. Okay. Okay, so that's how you make a secondary story, and this is just another example here of creating an invalid story, and you just pass the invalid prop the same way you would for the secondary one. And now you'll be able to see your stories in the browser, which is very cool, right? And now basically you can go and pat yourself on the back, revel in your genius, congratulate yourself however you want. But the next thing we want to do is be able to play around with them, right? So we will do that with the controls panel we looked at earlier. And to do that, we'll use what Storybook calls archetypes. And archetypes describe the behavior of all of our components, args. So for example, we have a label arg, right, which is a string. What if we want to be able to edit that in the browser to see what our button would look like with like a really long call to action in it? Well, the same way we created an args object, we'll create an archetypes object as well. Each key will reference an already existing arg, and each value will be a control object. And all the control object does is it tells the browser what type of editing control to give this particular arg. So as you see, label is a string, so we'll pass that control value of text. Disabled is a Boolean, so we'll pass that. And for our size prop, we've got 3 options set up. So we've got small, medium, large. So we'll pass that a radio type control. So we'll be able to like flick through them individually to see what they look like. So the way you do that is you pass the control object another one of type radio, and you give it an array of options which all match your prop names. And once you've got that and you load it in the browser, you should be able to see the controls panel. We get it up here. So now we've got our same component and we've got a label field that we can change the text of immediately in the browser, which is really nice because you don't have to be a developer to go and do this, and you don't have to like learn all of the codey bits. So it's really handy for the whole team. You can see what it looks like in a disabled state. And as I said, you can kind of flip between what it looks like in different sizes with that long label, which is pretty cool. And this is just another example here of some other cool controls that you can use. We'll just take a look at this heading and bullet list component here. It's just a nice example of where you can use like array and select as archetypes. So in the default.args object there on line 22, you will see we have an outcomes list prop. And to that, we're just passing an array of strings to it, right, which end up as the bullet points in the component. And a bit further down on line 30, you'll see that we're using a theme prop. So a lot of people might have in their design systems different themes, like a light theme or a dark theme. And this control will get rendered as a drop-down list in the controls panel. And to see how, just look down to line 38 there, I believe. And you'll see that we're passing a control of type select. And in the same way that we did for the radio, we're passing an options array of strings that match our theme labels. So just have a look at this in action. So now you can see everything is passed over into the canvas and the controls there. And you can start messing around with all of these components to see what it looks like. So hopefully you can kind of start to see the value of this, right? Instead of having to go through that really long change request process, if, for example, you just need to change some copy, you can just hop onto Storybook and just test out stuff and see what it looks like. So, all you have to do is like add bullet points separated by comma there. You'll also be able to change stuff like the heading. And you've got the theme there underneath, which at the moment is light. But if you've got, you can add as many different drop-downs as you want. If you've got like tons of different color themes for your design system, you'll just choose between it to see what it looks like in dark mode, for example, or in pink. And Storybook also just has really nice user-friendly UI. So it's got this nice little color palette thing that you can use just to, if you want to like mess around with different colors in different parts of a component. It's just a really nice little UI that you can use to test. And you can reset it there to the original one. And Storybook has lots of different controls, so I've only just shown you a couple, but it's got tons that you can go through online. They have really good docs. So if you are interested, I just recommend going online to have a look at the ones that you can use. Plenty to choose from. They're all listed there, and you can have a look and play around yourself. And just to note that you can build up stories as much as you like, same way in components. So you can add assets, you can add decorators and all sorts of add-ons if you want, which just means that it's really flexible and pretty cool to work with. And as I just mentioned, Storybook has really great documentation and lots of tutorials and resources online so that so anyone can hop on. So if you think you're interested, even if you don't particularly code that much, you might want to give it a go. They have really good docs, so it's really not as scary as you might think it is. And although most of the changes that we made to the stories today were relatively straightforward ones, hopefully, as I say, you can kind of begin to see how useful this tool can be in a wider tech team, right? The key thing as well, actually, is that once you publish all of your stories, or once you have all of your stories, sorry, you can publish your storybook online. So literally anyone like designers, product managers, marketers can go to your storybook page and just go and have a look around with everything themselves. They don't need to rely on the developers, which is really handy. And it is handy in these two particular ways. So first, for developers, just being able to focus on one component at a time to make sure that you've written it without any bugs, as cleanly as possible, before integrating it with any other code. It's just really nice. And for anyone else on the team, as I say, who wants to make a change request, instead of having to go through like Figma and designers and content managers and tickets and pull requests, all they have to do is go to Storybook and see for themselves. So yeah, remember this workflow I mentioned earlier? With Storybook, like I kind of want to say you can like forget about it, but like obviously you can't totally forget about it. But at the very least, I think you'll be using this a lot less and everyone will just have like more time to work on more important stuff. So the whole team now, if you're using Storybook, is way less dependent on devs, which is great for everyone. Your code base is more structured and well organized. Stories can act as component documentation, which is really handy. Everyone has autonomy to try out new designs. Marketers can test out new copy, again, without relying on devs. And developers can just test their UI during the build rather than having to wait for it to be up and in the testing environment first. And it just means that there's way less of that niggly back and forth when you're trying to get something deployed, which can be pretty frustrating. So honestly, using Storybook, I think, just saves so much time and effort across the board. You'll be a new woman, basically. Like this man. Basically, I am hoping that once you start using Storybook, this is how you're going to feel. It is how I felt after I started using it, and I'm pretty sure it's how a lot of other people on my team felt when we implemented it. I love Storybook. I should caveat, I don't actually work for Storybook. But I just think it's a really great tool for everyone on the team, not just developers, and I highly encourage everyone to check it out. So that's pretty much it from me. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find me on Twitter there, where I'll post a few links later to anything Storybook related, but I do also like to talk about things that aren't Storybook. So if you fancy hopping on there, follow me, connect with me. I'd love to chat to you. And yeah, nothing left to say, but thank you so much for having me.